The X-ray shouldn't have shown anything unusual. A 70-year-old woman, routine fall, possible hip fracture, standard emergency room protocol for a Tuesday evening that had already been filled with the usual assortment of cases. Chest pains, broken bones, a few overdoses, the typical chaos that defines modern emergency medicine. But as the radiologist pulled up the images on his screen, he went completely silent. Then he called me down to the ER with an urgency I hadn't heard in his voice in 15 years. "Doctor, you need to see this," he said, pointing at the monitor with a finger that was visibly trembling. "This woman, she's pregnant." I looked at the screen, then at him, then back at the screen, certain I had misheard. The patient in question was clearly past menopause, had been for decades according to her chart. But there, unmistakably visible in her abdomen, was what appeared to be a full-term fetal skeleton. "That's impossible," I said, moving closer to the monitor to get a better look. "That's what I thought, but look closer. Look at the bone density." As my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing, the impossible became undeniable. The tiny bones were perfectly formed, ribs, skull, long bones, even what appeared to be fingers and toes, but they had a strange, almost crystalline appearance. They weren't the bones of a living fetus. They looked more like fossils, ancient, calcified, preserved in some way I couldn't immediately explain. That was my first encounter with the patient, though I wouldn't learn her story for another hour, and that X-ray was the beginning of a medical mystery that would haunt me for years to come, challenging everything I thought I knew about pregnancy, loss, and the remarkable resilience of the human body. When I walked into room 11, I expected to find a confused elderly woman, perhaps someone who didn't understand her own medical history, or was experiencing some form of dementia-related confusion. Instead, I found a small, dignified lady sitting upright on the examination table, her dark eyes alert and intelligent. She was wearing a traditional headscarf and a simple black dress, and there was something about her posture that suggested she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. "Ma'am," I began, glancing at the chart to check her name. "I'm the OB-GYN specialist. The ER doctor asked me to come speak with you about something we found on your X-ray." She nodded slowly, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "You found my baby." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge to everything I thought I knew about medicine. I had been practicing obstetrics and gynecology for 18 years. I had delivered over 3,000 babies, handled every possible complication from placental abruption to shoulder dystocia, seen every variation of normal and abnormal that pregnancy could offer. But this woman was telling me she had a baby visible on an X-ray, and she was 70 years old. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your medical history. When was your last pregnancy?" 1955, she said without hesitation. "I was 24 years old." I did the math in my head, certain I had misunderstood. That was 46 years ago. "And what happened to that pregnancy?" For the first time, her composure cracked slightly. Her hands moved unconsciously to her abdomen, a gesture so automatic it seemed like muscle memory developed over decades of practice. "She never came out," the patient said quietly. "The labor started, but she never came out." Over the next hour, as I gently questioned her about that long-ago pregnancy, a story emerged that belonged more to a medical journal from the 19th century than to modern obstetrics. The patient had been living in a remote rural area when she became pregnant with her second child. Her first delivery had been normal, healthy, at home with the assistance of a local midwife who had been delivering babies in the community for decades. But this pregnancy was different from the beginning, she explained. "I carried her differently," she said, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving memories that were both precious and painful. "Higher and to one side. The midwife said some babies just sit different, but I knew something was not right. A mother knows these things." When labor began, it progressed normally at first. Contractions came in regular intervals, and she could feel what seemed like a baby moving toward birth. The midwife was confident, experienced, prepared for a normal delivery. But then, after hours of seemingly productive labor, everything stopped. The pain was terrible, she said, her voice distant with memory. Like nothing I had experienced before, not even with my first child. And there was blood, so much blood. The midwife, she tried everything she knew, different positions, herbal remedies, prayers. But after 3 days, she told my husband I was going to die. What happened then? The pain stopped. Just stopped. Like someone had cut a rope. The bleeding slowed, and I felt the baby move up, back inside. The midwife said the baby had died, that my body would take care of it. She said to wait, that nature would finish what it had started. And did it? The patient shook her head slowly. I waited for months. I could still feel her in there, but she never came. After a year, I stopped asking questions. After 5 years, I stopped talking about it. After 10 years, people said I was crazy for thinking there was still something inside me. But you always knew. A mother knows, she said simply. Even when doctors tell her she is wrong, even when her own family thinks she is losing her mind, a mother knows. The conviction in her voice was absolute, unshakable. This wasn't the confused rambling of an elderly woman with dementia. This was someone who had spent nearly half a century carrying a secret that no one believed, maintaining a certainty that flew in the face of medical consensus. I ordered a CT scan immediately. If what this patient was telling me was true, if she had indeed been carrying a fetus for 46 years, we were dealing with one of the rarest phenomena in medical literature. I had read about lithopedians, stone babies, in medical school, but they were presented as historical curiosities, not conditions I would ever encounter in practice. The waiting period while the CT scan was processed felt eternal. I found myself pacing the hallway outside radiology, my mind racing through possibilities. Could this woman really have been carrying a calcified fetus for nearly half a century? Was such preservation even medically possible? And if so, what did it mean for our understanding of pregnancy, loss, and the body's ability to adapt to impossible circumstances? As we waited for the CT results, I found myself studying the patient more carefully. She was remarkably healthy for a woman her age, with no major medical issues in her history. Her chart showed that she had gone on to have 3 more children after 1955, all delivered normally, all healthy. She had worked, raised her family, lived what appeared to be a completely normal life, except for the persistent belief that she was still carrying her second child. Did you ever seek medical attention? Try to find out what happened? Many times in the early years, she said. But the doctors would examine me and say there was nothing there. They said I was imagining things, that I needed to accept that the pregnancy was over. One doctor said I was having a mental breakdown from grief. But you never stopped believing. How could I? I could feel her. Sometimes at night, I would put my hand on my belly and feel this hard spot, like a rock. It never went away. It grew smaller over the years, but it never went away. When the CT images finally came back, they confirmed what the X-ray had suggested, but in far greater detail. There, perfectly preserved in the patient's abdominal cavity, was a complete fetal skeleton. The bones were surrounded by a shell of calcified tissue so dense it appeared white on the scan. The position was unmistakably that of a breech presentation, which explained why her labor had stopped so abruptly decades earlier. But what was most remarkable was the level of preservation. This wasn't just a collection of bones. It was a complete intact fetus that had been naturally mummified by her body's own protective mechanisms. Her immune system had essentially created a tomb of calcium around the dead tissue, preventing infection while preserving the remains of her child. I had to sit down when I realized what I was looking at. This was a lithopedion, one of fewer than 300 cases ever documented in medical literature, and this patient had been carrying it for 46 years. The medical team gathered to review the images was stunned into silence. The radiology resident who first pulled up the scans actually gasped audibly. The chief of radiology, a man who had seen every possible variation of human anatomy in 30 years of practice, just stared at the monitor and slowly shook his head. "In all my years," he said quietly, "I have never seen preservation this complete." But the story was far from over. The medical implications were staggering, but the human implications were even more profound. When I returned to room 11 to explain to the patient what we had found, her reaction surprised me. Instead of shock or distress, she seemed almost relieved, as if a weight she had been carrying for decades was finally being acknowledged. "So, I was not crazy," she said. And there was something in her voice, not triumph, but validation. Deep, profound validation. "No," I said. "You were not crazy. You were carrying your daughter all along. Can you take her out? Can I see her?" That question launched a complex ethical and medical discussion that would consume the next several days. At 70 years old, the patient was not an ideal candidate for major abdominal surgery. The lithopedion had been there for nearly half a century without causing serious health problems. Removing it now carried significant risks that had to be weighed against potential benefits. But the patient was insistent. "Doctor, I have been waiting 46 years to see my daughter. I need to know what she looks like." The case attracted immediate attention from colleagues throughout the hospital. Word spread quickly through the medical community, not through official channels, but through the informal network of whispered conversations that carries extraordinary cases from department to department. By the end of the week, specialists from 3 different hospitals had requested permission to review the case files. After extensive consultations with colleagues and detailed discussions with the patient and her family, we scheduled the surgery. The operation would be challenging. Decades of calcification had likely fused the lithopedion to surrounding tissues. But the patient was determined, and frankly, the medical team was fascinated by the opportunity to study such a rare phenomenon. The preparation for surgery took weeks. We needed specialists from multiple disciplines: general surgeons experienced with complex abdominal procedures, an anesthesiologist with expertise in elderly patients, a pathologist who specialized in unusual specimens, and a team of nurses trained in handling both the medical and emotional complexities of such an extraordinary case. The patient remained remarkably calm throughout the preparation process. She signed consent forms with steady hands, asked practical questions about recovery time, and seemed to approach the upcoming surgery with the same quiet determination she had maintained for 4 decades. "Are you nervous?" I asked her during one of our preoperative consultations. "No," she said simply. "I have been waiting for this moment since 1955. I am ready." The surgery was scheduled for early on a Thursday morning in November. The operating room had been specially prepared with additional imaging equipment to document the procedure for medical literature. As we prepared for the operation, I found myself thinking about what we might find, trying to prepare mentally for the reality of extracting a 46-year-old calcified fetus. The lithopedion was immediately visible when we opened the patient's abdomen. It appeared as a smooth, oval mass about the size of a full-term baby, covered in a thick layer of calcified tissue that had the texture and appearance of old ivory. The surface was remarkably smooth, almost polished, as if decades of gentle movement within the abdominal cavity had worn away any rough edges. The mass had indeed become partially fused to the peritoneal wall, requiring careful dissection to remove safely. What struck me most was how the patient's body had adapted around it. Blood vessels had grown around the calcified mass, and other organs had shifted position to accommodate it. It was as if her entire abdominal anatomy had reorganized itself to make room for this permanent resident. When we finally extracted it intact, the operating room fell silent. What we held was something that belonged in a museum rather than a modern hospital. A perfectly preserved baby, encased in a natural calcium sarcophagus that had protected both mother and child for nearly half a century. The pathology examination revealed details that were both heartbreaking and miraculous. The baby had been a girl, approximately 34 weeks gestational age when she died. The breech presentation had caused the pregnancy to fail during what had been an abdominal pregnancy, a condition where the fetus develops outside the uterus, in the abdominal cavity. But what was most remarkable was the level of detail that had been preserved. Through the calcium coating, we could make out tiny fingernails, wisps of hair, even facial features. It was as if the patient's body had created a natural time capsule, preserving her daughter exactly as she had been at the moment of death. The calcification process, we learned, was the body's way of protecting itself from what could have been a fatal infection. When the dead fetal tissue couldn't be expelled naturally, the maternal immune system had encased it in calcium, creating a sterile environment that prevented decomposition and sepsis. It was a remarkable adaptation that had literally saved the patient's life while preserving her daughter's remains. The surgery itself went smoothly, but the emotional impact was profound. When the patient woke up in recovery and I told her that we had successfully removed her daughter, she asked a question that I will never forget. Was she beautiful? How do you answer a question like that? How do you describe a calcified fetus to a mother who has waited 46 years to meet her child? Yes, I said. She was beautiful. With the patient's permission, we prepared the lithopedion for study and eventual preservation at the medical school. But before any academic work began, she requested time alone with her daughter. I accompanied her to the pathology lab, where the lithopedion had been carefully cleaned and placed on an examination table. The patient approached slowly, her 70-year-old hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the calcified surface. "Hello, my little one," she whispered. "Mama is finally here." She stood there for nearly an hour, just looking, occasionally reaching out to trace the outline of tiny limbs through the calcium shell. She was not crying, but there was something profound happening in that room, a meeting that had been 46 years in the making. "I knew you were still with me," she said softly. "Even when everyone told me you were gone, I knew you were still there." The patient named her daughter, choosing a name that meant precious gift in her native language. She held a small memorial service for her, attended by children and grandchildren who were learning for the first time the full story of what their mother and grandmother had endured. The case attracted international attention from the medical community. The lithopedion was one of the longest carried ever documented, and the level of preservation was unprecedented. I presented the case at conferences around the world, and it was published in several major medical journals. But for me, the most important aspect was not the medical rarity or the scientific interest. It was what the case taught me about the connection between mothers and their children, and about the importance of listening to patients even when their stories seem impossible. This patient had spent 46 years being told she was wrong about her own body. Medical professionals, family members, and friends had dismissed her persistent belief that she was still carrying her child. She had been labeled as delusional, grief-stricken, unable to accept reality. But her body had known the truth all along. Her intuition had been correct. And when modern medicine finally caught up with her experience, she was vindicated in the most profound way possible. The formation of a lithopedion is actually one of the most remarkable protective mechanisms the human body possesses. When faced with dead fetal tissue that cannot be expelled and could potentially cause life-threatening infection, the maternal immune system creates a sterile tomb, encasing the tissue in calcium to prevent it from harming the mother. It allows women to survive what should be a fatal condition. But there is something deeply moving about the idea that a mother's body will preserve her child in this way. Even in death, Even when the pregnancy has failed, the maternal body continues to protect and preserve. The lithopedion becomes a kind of natural monument to the child that was lost and the love that endures. After the surgery, the patient's recovery was swift and uncomplicated. But more importantly, for the first time in 46 years, she was free of the knowledge that her daughter was still unreachable inside her body. She had finally been able to meet her child, to hold her, to say goodbye. "I feel complete now," she told me during a follow-up visit. "For so many years, I felt like something was unfinished. Now I know my daughter is at peace, and so am I." The case also highlighted the dramatic differences in medical care between different eras and different parts of the world. In 1955, in a remote rural area, a woman experiencing pregnancy complications had no access to the kind of medical intervention that could have saved her baby or prevented the formation of a lithopedion. By 2001, medical technology had advanced to the point where we could not only diagnose her condition precisely, but remove the lithopedion safely and give her the closure she had been seeking for nearly half a century. I often think about the implications of this case for our understanding of pregnancy and loss. How many women throughout history have experienced similar unexplained pregnancies? How many have carried the physical and emotional weight of lost children without ever knowing what really happened? The lithopedion itself taught us about the incredible adaptability of the human body. For 46 years, the patient had lived, worked, raised other children, and functioned normally, all while carrying what was essentially a natural mummy in her abdominal cavity. Her body had not only adapted to accommodate it, but had actually used it as a protective mechanism to prevent what could have been a fatal infection. Modern medicine has made lithopedion increasingly rare, as improved prenatal care means that abdominal pregnancies are usually detected early and managed appropriately. But cases still occur, particularly in parts of the world where medical care is limited, or when women, for various reasons, don't seek prenatal care. The patient's story also raised important questions about how we listen to women in medical settings. How many patients have been dismissed when they tried to describe symptoms or experiences that didn't fit neatly into medical textbooks? How many have been told they were imagining things when their own bodies were telling them something different? In this case, a woman's intuition about her own body proved to be more accurate than decades of medical opinion. She had known with absolute certainty that she was still carrying her child. Medical professionals had examined her and found nothing wrong, had told her she was suffering from grief-induced delusions, but she had been right all along. Today, the patient is in her 80s and in excellent health. She lives with her youngest daughter and spends her days teaching her granddaughters traditional crafts. She speaks openly about her experience now, and has become something of a local celebrity in her community. The lithopedion itself is now part of the permanent collection at our medical school's museum, where it serves as both an educational tool and a memorial. The placard beside the display case tells the basic facts of the case, but it cannot capture the full story of a mother's 46-year vigil or the remarkable strength required to carry such a burden. But every time I pass that display case, I think about what this patient taught me. That the female body is capable of adaptations we are only beginning to understand. That maternal intuition often knows truths that medical science takes decades to confirm, and that love, once formed, never truly dies. It simply transforms, adapts, and endures in ways that continue to amaze me. The case fundamentally changed how I practice medicine. I listen more carefully now when patients tell me things that seem impossible. I ask more questions when someone insists they know something about their body that I can't immediately confirm. And I remember that medicine is not just about treating diseases, but about bearing witness to the extraordinary stories that our patients trust us to hear. The stone baby that this remarkable woman carried for nearly half a century was more than just a rare medical phenomenon. It was a testament to the fact that some connections transcend the boundaries between life and death, and that sometimes the most extraordinary medical cases are also the most profoundly human stories. In the end, this case reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place, not just to treat diseases or deliver babies, but to honor the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and to recognize that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply believe our patients when they tell us they know something we don't understand yet.